Welcome back to Crypto Equation. Today we are diving into a topic that has shaken the XRP community and caught the attention of analysts, banks, and even policy insiders. People are calling it leaked information. Others say it is simply public data that finally makes sense when you connect the dots. Either way, something big is forming on the horizon. There is a moment coming for XRP that many believe could trigger its next major upsurge, not based on hype or guesses, but based on timelines, signals, infrastructure upgrades, and global adoption phases that all seem to converge into the same window. That is what we are exploring today. Not an exact date, not a promise, but a realistic time frame that major institutions appear to be preparing for, even if they are not saying it out loud. And if you stay until the end, you will see why this window is tied to liquidity demands, rising regulation, clarity, global settlement acceleration, and a quiet shift in how cross-border payments are being rebuilt behind the scenes. What most retail investors do not understand is that these kinds of financial shifts rarely appear as breaking news. They build slowly, silently, layer by layer, until suddenly everything clicks and the price reacts all at once. That is why people call it overnight, even when it was years in the making. So today we explore the real foundations behind the idea of an XRP upsurge window. Not hype cycles, not charts alone, but the structural signals that institutions follow long before retail ever catches on. To understand why people are talking about a specific period of time, we have to start with the changes happening inside the banking system, because this is where XRP's purpose becomes undeniable. One of the biggest clues comes from settlement timelines that major financial institutions have publicly committed to. Many payment networks are transitioning toward instant settlement infrastructures by the mid-2020s. This includes messaging upgrades, liquidity corridors, tokenization initiatives, and ISO integration work that all point to greater efficiency, higher speed, and lower friction. When settlement becomes instant, the infrastructure supporting those settlements also transforms, and that is where XRP's design finally starts to make sense to the wider financial world. Another major clue comes from regulatory calendars. The next round of updated clarity discussions for digital assets is expected to align inside a similar time period. And historically, once clarity arrives, institutional hesitation begins to break down. They move carefully, but they move decisively. This matters because large-scale adoption rarely begins in an unregulated environment. Institutions do not gamble, they follow frameworks. When frameworks become clear, they deploy capital and integrate new solutions. And it just so happens that the time windows analysts are watching line up almost perfectly with the liquidity expansion cycles Ripple has talked about in public presentations. These are not predictions. These are patterns that repeat across every major financial transformation. The question becomes, why is all of this pointing toward the same period, and what makes XRP so strategically positioned that experts believe this window could change everything? To understand that, you have to look at liquidity demand. Global liquidity is tightening. Cross-border settlements are still slow, expensive, and fragmented in many regions, and many governments are working to modernize their payment rails. XRP is built for one purpose: moving value across borders with speed, scalability, and consistent finality. When liquidity demand rises, the assets that can support high throughput often experience renewed interest. And when institutions look to improve efficiency, they shift toward assets that reduce operational costs. XRP checks these boxes. But the most overlooked clue comes from the growth of tokenized value. Tokenization is moving from concept to implementation in real financial systems. Tokenized bonds, tokenized real estate, tokenized currencies, tokenized treasury products. What do all of these have in common? They require fast settlement to operate at scale, and that is where XRP's design fits perfectly. When tokenized value accelerates, liquidity corridors must also evolve, and that is why many analysts believe XRP will eventually sit at the heart of global settlement rails, connecting tokenized assets with the real-world financial system. This is not a dream. This is not speculation. This is based on actual adoption curves and infrastructure development. Now let's talk about the so-called leaked information. It is not a secret file. It is not an insider whisper. It is simply a series of overlooked public documents, updates, and transition timelines that all appear to point to the same conclusion. A major settlement upgrade cycle is coming, and when it arrives, assets designed for settlement efficiency will become exponentially more important. When investors hear the word leak, they picture something dramatic. But in reality, this is about connecting the signals institutions quietly upload into reports, calendars, and transition frameworks. The real leak is the fact that almost nobody pays attention to these documents, except people who deeply understand market infrastructure. And when these individuals began piecing together these updates, a potential time frame started to emerge. That is what today's video is about. A realistic window where the financial system aligns with XRP's design and where utility growth could accelerate faster than most expect. Now here's where things get interesting. Historical financial shifts reveal something surprising. Markets rarely react when the groundwork is being built. Instead, they explode when the infrastructure is complete. and the world finally realizes what has been forming beneath the surface. That is why gold surged only after monetary systems changed. That is why tech stocks exploded only after the internet infrastructure was complete. And that is why many analysts believe XRP could experience a similar pattern when global settlement upgrades activate and utility begins scaling. But before we continue, let me make something clear, because accuracy matters on this channel. No one can predict a guaranteed date for price movement. That is not how global markets work. What we can identify is the alignment of conditions and the window where everything institutions need is positioned to go live. This is the foundation of today's topic. Not prediction, but preparation. Not hype, but awareness. Not fantasy, but functionality. So what exactly happens inside this upsurge window? First, the infrastructure deployment phase. This is happening quietly as banks migrate to faster rails. Second, the liquidity optimization phase. This is where assets like XRP become more viable as settlement tools. Third, the institutional comfort phase. This begins once regulation and legal clarity remove uncertainty. Fourth, the global adoption phase. This is when networks require fast settlement to operate at scale. All of these phases appear to converge into a similar time frame, which is why analysts are talking about an upsurge window, not a guaranteed date. And remember, retail investors usually notice these patterns last. Institutions position early. Developers position early. Analysts position early. Retail moves only after the market already reacts. That is why understanding these patterns matters. It is not about certainty. It is about awareness. And awareness is what separates the early prepared investor from the late panicked investor. Now let's break down why this window carries so much weight and why so many experts keep pointing to it, even when they avoid making direct predictions. The financial world operates in cycles, cycles of development, cycles of regulation, cycles of adoption, and cycles of liquidity expansion. Every major shift begins with a long, quiet buildup. The clues are always there, but they are almost always underestimated until the shift is already in motion. With XRP, the clues are not hidden. They are simply overlooked. For example, settlement testing across institutions has increased dramatically. You do not see this in headlines. You see it in reports, regulatory filings, pilot program documents, and technology integration briefs. These are not rumors. These are real signals. And when these signals start clustering within the same time frame, that is when analysts begin to say something is preparing to move. The so-called upsurge window is tied to three primary forces all converging together. The first force is regulatory structure. When regulators finalize frameworks, institutions gain confidence. You will not see massive adoption in an uncertain environment. But when the rules become clear, the floodgates open. This type of shift has happened in every major financial transformation, from the formation of ETFs to the approval of money market reforms to the rise of digital trading systems. XRP is positioned uniquely in this regard because its legal status has already undergone levels of scrutiny that most digital assets have never faced. This means that once the broader regulatory landscape stabilizes, XRP enters the next phase from both a legal and a functional perspective. The second force is liquidity demand. Global finance today is constrained by slow friction-filled processes. Supply chains, banking networks, remittance systems, and institutional transfers all struggle with legacy settlement models. The world needs faster liquidity movement, not for speculative reasons, but for operational stability. As tokenized assets grow, the need for instant settlement becomes even more urgent. XRP solves this problem directly. And this is where analysts believe demand could increase quickly once the infrastructure upgrades mature. The third force is institutional integration. This is the quiet process where banks, payment networks, and financial technology firms test new systems behind the scenes. This is not speculation. This is how the financial world operates. Testing is not loud. It is not public. It does not appear in breaking news. It appears in patterns that only become obvious in hindsight. And it is these patterns that suggest institutions are preparing for a transition where settlement solutions like XRP could finally operate at scale. Now, why does this matter for you, the everyday investor? Because when these three forces converge, the market does not move slowly. It moves suddenly. This is why people refer to overnight reactions. It is not that the system changed in one night. It is that the realization of the change hit the market all at once. And that is what analysts believe could happen to XRP. A sudden recognition of utility, a sudden demand increase, a sudden awareness that the rails for global settlement have quietly shifted. When this recognition happens, charts no longer tell the story. Utility takes over. Liquidity requirements take over. Market structure takes over. And assets built for function, not speculation, finally get valued according to their purpose. This is why the so-called leaked information resonated with so many people. Not because it promised a date, but because it exposed how many signals the public was not paying attention to. Now let's talk about what this upsurge could realistically look like, because this is where clarity matters more than hype. No serious analyst promises an exact number. But what they do point out is that when utility assets reach global adoption, their valuation tends to reflect the scale of the system they support. If XRP becomes a core asset for settlement corridors, liquidity bridging, and tokenized markets, its valuation will not be based on speculation. It will be based on demand. And demand in global systems is measured in trillions, not millions. But again, this is not a guarantee. It is a function of how financial networks operate at scale. The reason we talk about windows instead of dates is because financial transformations rarely occur at a precise moment. They happen when the system is ready. And everything we are seeing today suggests the system is moving toward that readiness. Infrastructure is upgrading. Regulations are forming. Tokenization is expanding. Banks are modernizing. Payment rails are transforming. These are not random events. These are coordinated steps in a global transition toward real-time settlement. And in that world, assets like XRP gain relevance quickly. But here's the part that investors do not hear often enough. Opportunity is never obvious while it is forming. It is uncomfortable. It is uncertain. It is misunderstood. And that is exactly why only a small percentage of people position early. By the time the world accepts a new financial standard, the early window has already closed. That is why awareness matters. That is why understanding the signals matters. That is why studying infrastructure timelines matters. And that is why channels like Crypto Equation exist to help you see what most people overlook. Now let's map out what analysts believe could unfold as the Upsurge window approaches. First, institutions finalize integrations. This is a quiet process, but it is essential. Second, liquidity corridors expand. This increases the volume of value moving across networks. Third, regulatory clarity activates institutional participation. This reduces hesitation and unlocks capital deployment. Fourth, tokenization reaches commercial scale. This requires instant settlement solutions. Fifth, global settlement becomes streamlined. This is where assets like XRP step into their full purpose. When these phases align, the market does not ask permission. It reacts. And when it reacts, it often leaves behind those who waited for certainty before acting. Now let's return to the question everyone asks. Why is the timing becoming such a big topic? The answer is simple. The signals are not isolated anymore. They are converging. They are aligning. They are accelerating. And when enough signals align, analysts begin to recognize patterns. Not predictions, but patterns. Patterns that suggest a transition is approaching. And that is exactly where we are today with XRP. So as we close this breakdown, here's what you need to understand. The Upsurge window is not magic. It is not hype. It is not fantasy. It is the natural result of a global system modernizing itself. And if XRP continues on its current path, its relevance to that system could grow dramatically. Some investors will see this early. Some will understand the signals. Some will position patiently. Others will ignore the signs and only realize what was happening when the shift is already complete. The question is not when the upsurge date is. The real question is whether you understand the forces that make such an upsurge possible. Because once the financial system reaches its tipping point, the reaction will not be subtle. It will be sudden. It will be fast. It will be decisive. And it will reward those who recognize the signals when the world was still uncertain. This is the window analysts are talking about. Not a prediction, but an alignment. Not a promise, but a possibility. Not a secret leak, but information hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to connect the dots. And that is exactly what we do here at Crypto Equation.